So as Megan mentioned, my name is Margot Dushin. I'm Director of Programs for the Social Enterprise Initiative at HBS. And we will give you some more information about the social enterprise track of the New Venture competition. But a lot of this is open material and helpful material for anyone who's thinking about starting a social venture. I'm going to have Brian spend just a minute in introducing himself and telling you about WAVE so that you have that context as we go into this session. But this is going to be a dialogue with the two of us in being able to bring to you what elements are of a business plan, and having Brian be able to illustrate specifically how that played out for WAVE when they were in the competition last year and did a stellar job as a runner-up to the competition, and how that's played out in just a year since then. But you guys have really made great traction, so we're going to be able to hear from Brian. So Brian, can you start off us with just a brief description of WAVE?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Brian Mesway, and about a year ago I sat exactly where you guys are sitting right now. We had three of us originally, all MBA students from the class of 2013. And we met actually here at the iLab and discussed potentially launching a vocational education platform for West Africa. So that's what WAVE is. So WAVE stands for West Africa Vocational Education. And about a year ago, we came together and we decided that we saw the problem of unemployment all across West Africa. Two of us were Nigerian, one of us was Ghanaian. And we started this platform effectively as a way to take kids that were unemployed and put them in jobs in the hospitality sector and the retail sector. So I'll talk a lot more about WAVE in a bit, but effectively, you know, it doesn't take that much to go from not having an idea to winning the social enterprise initiative. So
Great, great.
There's hope.
Thank you. Can everyone hear us okay as we're talking? Okay, and I do want to there were a couple questions about the PowerPoint that we have. I do want to let you know that those will be available on the New Venture Competition website within the next few days. So you can take notes if you want to, but this will be available afterwards too. So let's start with definitions of social enterprise. Howard Stevenson, who has done amazing work in the area of entrepreneurship, has talked about entrepreneurship as being the pursuit of an opportunity regardless of the resources that you currently control. So when we think about social entrepreneurship, this is where we use that building definition, but then talk about it as creating pattern-breaking social change. And when we think about social enterprise, the definition that we use at HBS and that we use for our New Venture competition is that this is any sector. It could be nonprofit, for-profit, or public sector. And in fact, in recent years, about half of our plans for the New Venture competition have been for-profit plans. In any of the cases, you have to think about sustainability, but whether it's nonprofit or for-profit with a direct social purpose, we think about that as social enterprise. So here are some of the elements that we're going to be talking through, and this is not meant to be prescriptive. It's not meant to say, here is your list and put this in this order and you'll have your business plan, but more to think about with your idea and the way that you want to be able to present it to partners, to investors, to potential team members. How do you think about the different elements, and then where you're going to put emphasis, where you need to focus, and how you're going to tell a story with all of these things. So we're going to go through in a pretty linear way, but this is not your cheat sheet. This is not your table of contents or business plan. It's more about elements that you'd want to consider as you're developing it. The first thing that you want to think about, obviously, is the problem and the opportunity. And many of you probably are already at this problem stage and have been thinking about why it's important, what scale might look like, what are the contributing factors and root causes. This is what's kind of kept you up at night. This is what made you passionate about the idea and why you want to take this entrepreneurial route. But you also need to think about the opportunity. Why is it solvable? What other approaches have been tried? And what unique approach might you be doing? What vision are you bringing to this? So I'd love to pause there for a minute, Brian, and say, for your team, WAVE,
Yeah.
how were you thinking about this?
So we actually met originally in the first year at HBS we had a friendship, all three of us, but we didn't have any plans of starting a business. So when we saw this coming around, we actually just met in a room. I think it was a room just outside the iLab there, and we tried to find common ground in stuff that we were all passionate about. And it turned out that we're all African, as I mentioned, West African. And also all had this passion for reducing unemployment, which is a pretty big burden in the area. So we went through a couple of ideas. We talked about perhaps agribusiness, we talked about education, we talked about a bunch of different things that could address that problem. And we came around to this idea because it felt for us like the best fit for the experiences that we had and the skill set we could bring to solve the problem. But we basically started off at the problem and at almost like a need or a passion that we had, and then went backwards to figure out how to solve it. I think it would have been a lot tougher to start off with the solution to the problem, especially for something that is in a social enterprise scenario, because you need to have that heart that actually makes it worth it.
That's a good lead into thinking about the mission and how teams and organizations need to be able to articulate what they're all about and what problem they're trying to solve. And you've probably seen this before about the 4 M's of mission statements, that they're memorable, manageable, measurable, and motivational. So we're going to throw a couple of mission statements up there, and this is a little pop quiz to see if you can identify which organization maps to the mission statement. So looking at this first one, one day all children in this country will have the opportunity to achieve an excellent education. You can yell it out. You got it, yep. Oh, I'm sorry. To give people the financial tools they need, microloans, business training, and other financial services to work their way out of poverty. Close? Other ideas? What did you say over here? Acción, got it, yep. Acción, yep. Tackling youth unemployment in West Africa, any thoughts here?
It was actually more than that. It was to do with tackling youth unemployment, but it was also to do with changing the face of customer service, which is another big issue in places like Nigeria and Ghana, where you go to a hotel or a restaurant and you feel worse than you felt before you went there. So we had so this was a simplified version of our longer mission.
And to clarify that, this was taken from their 100-character description that they submitted last year. So it's also a good way of thinking about, you're going to have times when you have a lot of space to talk about who you are, and you're going to have times when you have less than an elevator pitch where you just have about this amount of time. So that's that version of it. And then educating leaders to make a difference in the world. HBS. You can tell who's an HBS student and who may be new to the community here. So that's our mission statement. But it's interesting that some of these are readily identifiable with a specific organization, and some kind of create questions in your mind because there may be multiple organizations who are doing this work. Also, an important aspect of this, the theory of change. Are people familiar with this concept, or is this new to some? Okay. Theory of change, it's really the bridge. It's what's connecting the problem that you see with the solution that you want to bring to it, the strategy that you're going to bring to it. So it's based on your understanding of the problem and what your theory is of the actions and activities that need to, and the resources that you need that will lead to the results. So it's kind of an if-then statement. And as part of this, you need to think about the whole chain of what are the inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. And in some cases, you may only know the first part of that and may not be the only actor that's in play for this, but you do want to know what your place is in this and who others are in the field that are contributing to this as well. So as you're thinking about your theory of change, what's the research out there that can support it? Are there leaps of faith that you're going to have to defend or test? And what is it focusing on in terms of change? So we're going to pull up our TFA example here. And I'm just going to let you look at this. And it's really talking about what do they see as the change and how is that going to happen? So I'll give you a second to look at that. Brian, as we have this up, maybe you can talk a little bit about WAVE and how did you think about your theory of change?
Yeah, absolutely. So we walked back from the problem of unemployment, and we kind of said, so unemployment is affected by two things. There's the availability of jobs, and then there's the availability of skills, and you've got to match those two things together. Mm-hmm. And the problem in the area that we chose was twofold, because there was a jobs deficit, but also a skills deficit. And we had to basically figure out which one did we want to focus on, mm-hmm. and we picked skills, because we thought that we had more experiences to bear on that. And then we basically had to pick an industry where the jobs were being created. So we didn't have we're training these people that are skilled and then they don't have any jobs to go into. And hospitality ended up being that industry for us because at least in the data that we saw, there was a lot of growth coming and jobs coming online in hospitality with lots of hotels and restaurants being built across West Africa. So we got to that, and then we had to figure out, what made us, how could we link training kids to be good customer service representatives to actually reducing unemployment. And there had to be an element of just not a one-off training, but a continuous assessment and also some way of basically leveling the playing field such that if you didn't have access to these jobs before, because the systems are broken such that if you're smart, you potentially still don't have access to these jobs. So we had to basically let people that could not get the jobs despite being good get the jobs, and then also have that continuous assessment that allowed us to see how they were doing in the jobs. So we had to basically just work all the way from the top to the end goal of reducing unemployment.
So you've been on the ground for about a year now. Has that theory of change developed in any way? Has it changed?
It's definitely developed in the sense that we see, so the problem is as we thought it was, so the jobs and the skills aspects. We definitely see a little bit more than just the availability of skills as being the blockade to people getting those jobs. So for example, you have kids that, are pretty good, just natural salespeople, or natural, they smile when you see them, they're just great with people. And we figure out that they actually cannot speak English very well or write English very well. And there are like basic problems in the educational system that just put a block on how far people can progress. And we basically have to like walk around that and say, yes, this person doesn't meet all your interview objectives or prerequisites, but we think they can do the job pretty well, and we've assessed them, and we think they're the fit. And one way we've done that is actually we introduced an emotional intelligence assessment tool that effectively we're trying to make it the gold standard for the industry. There are a bunch of different ways that people look for talent today, and we're saying that those ways are not very effective because of the deficiencies of the system as a whole. So if you use our emotional assessment tool, we can tell you just from looking at that, this person has high potential for this industry and this person doesn't. So that's becoming more and more of an important thing for us to try and push our way through. But
so it's become part of your mission now to change the mindset.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it's become more of a social impact, or even like mindset view, as you say. Okay. And we probably thought about that a little bit, but we're seeing it more and more on the day and every day as we go along.
Interesting. Okay. So I'm going to say we're going to do a lot of talking up front just to lay these things out here, but we are going to leave time for Q&A. So start thinking about the questions that you might have overall, or for Brian specifically too. Looking at the strategy and business model, you've already touched upon this a little bit, thinking about the beneficiaries and the customers, what the program looks like, management structures, and so forth. I want to turn a little bit to the team here specifically. We think about the team at this early stage and the kind of skills that people need, the kind of passion that you need behind this, the personal connection to the mission. You talked about all of you being from West Africa and being able to identify this problem, but then also identifying where there's gaps and being able to see where you need expertise and how that team composition might change over time. So you talked a little bit about those first days here at HBS and the iLab. Tell me a little bit more about how your team has developed since then and how you identified what skills you needed. Yeah,
absolutely. So there were 3 of us, and we were all ex-consultants. So that's never a good sign when you have consultants, because they're very good at writing business plans, but not so good at actually making stuff happen. So we had to find people that could help us almost like have more of a sense of legitimacy to the business plan. One of our co-founders, who's actually the CEO of Wave, based in Nigeria now, Misan, was taking some classes at the education school across the river. So she invited a bunch of people from her school to help us write the business plan. There was also another HBS classmate whose parents ran a school in Togo, so it fit the mode of West Africa and also fit the mode of having experience, because he sat on the board of the school. So we convinced him to bring him on board. We basically had to beg him to join the team. But that was the team. So the team for the competition was 4 of us with the other HBS guy, and 5 with the education school person. But then we had a bunch of advisors all around. So we would get our finance friends to just push and find holes in our arguments and basically just challenge us. But the 5 of us were the main people that applied for this. And then since then, it's been pretty interesting because that team has ended up really just narrowing to Misan being the person that is 100% full-time on this business. So she's based in Nigeria and she runs pretty much the whole team from Nigeria. And myself and the Ghanaian that I mentioned earlier work part-time on this. So we have weekly meetings. I take care of some marketing, the website, and a bunch of other things. He takes care of the financial plan and fundraising. And Misan kind of runs things from Nigeria and does more of the operational side. The 4th person, whose parents ran a school in Togo, has actually stepped away from the business a little bit more. And he's working in the IFC or the World Bank, I think, in DC. But that core team has kind of like changed a little bit, and the dynamics have changed a lot since the competition and the business plan presentations. But on the flip side, a lot more people have come into play. So on the ground in Nigeria, we have a team of more or less 4 or 5 people, of which I think 3 or 4 of them are core, are basically 100% on this. And we're expanding pretty quickly, and we have, we're a non-profit, and we actually applied as a for-profit, but we're now a non-profit. So that's an interesting thing we can talk about as well. But as a non-profit, we had to kind of be slow on hiring people until we raised a lot of money. So we've had lots of part-time people as well for the first 6 months. Yeah. But the team is very different from the team that we applied with originally. Okay.
And what about a board? Do you have a board now, or are you developing one? And how did you think about the skills that you wanted the board to bring in?
We had an informal board of advisors, which included an HBS professor, a bunch of people that we, well, I say a bunch, 2 people that we've met during the process. Actually, during the competition, we've met some really interesting people that were very interested in the model and just wanted to be part of our progress. So they became part of our advisory board. We only recently started pushing towards a more formal board, mostly because we managed to raise some money in December, which was great news. So I guess we'll talk about that later on, the financials and stuff. But we raised some money in December, and it's from a venture philanthropy, so they're pushing us to become more formal. So we are in the process of getting a real board right now.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to here on scaling strategy. So this is interesting because some of you have this very nascent idea and have the idea of piloting it and know that there might be one site that you want to start in. But there's always the question of scale. And that's something that especially we've seen in the New Venture competition, that even if you do plan to pilot, even if you do plan to start small, they want to know what scale looks like, and they want to know kind of how you're thinking about it. Do you grow the organization? Do you launch more sites? Do you replicate the model and do that with other organizations and partnerships? Are you trying to create a movement? Are you trying to change a mindset? So there's many different ways of thinking about scale. And some of the considerations is, how do you maximize the value that you're trying to create? And how do you balance going to scale with keeping the quality and optimizing the value that you're creating? So even if your organization's in a very nascent stage, it's the kind of thing that you want to think about early and address in your plans, so that people know that you're thinking about this wisely and that you're making some of those early decisions in a thoughtful way too. Brian, would love to hear your perspectives on this part, and especially kind of how you thought about it at an early stage and how you presented that.
I think this was actually probably the most finger in the sky section of our presentation, because we had all these grand ambitions of how quickly we would grow, and we want to hit this many schools by this point of time and get this many employers on board by this point of time. And it's tricky because we're a two-sided network. We take kids and we place them in with employers, and both of those sides have to grow at the same time. So I think we had some pretty ambitious numbers, and at this point of time we had actually done a pilot in, I think the pilot was in the spring break, maybe not. It was a few months before the competition. So we knew what it might feel like on the ground. And I think that helped for this section in particular. But effectively we said, this is where we want to get to by the end of year one. And we figured out that if we just put some numbers to the population of kids in the schools that we wanted to target, really, really wild assumptions. And then we figured that we could get employers that would want to employ them. And I guess the thing in this section as well is that you almost want to think about not just the numbers, but how do you get there? So, marketing. How do we reach out to these youths? I think we had the plan of using a very social media heavy strategy to get out to them. On the ground, that's actually been not as helpful as just going to meet them physically, going to schools, going to other NGOs on the ground that work with youths, convincing them that this was a potentially useful thing for them to do. With employers, we have found some of them a lot more reticent originally than we expected, because you're basically telling them that your HR system is better than their internal HR system. For them to believe that, there has to be some history of performance that you've had. So I think that this area was probably a bit more ambitious for us originally, but in terms of how we did it, we just basically put some numbers there, make some assumptions.
So thinking back to your participation in the New Venture competition, saying that this was ambitious, did you get any direct feedback from judges or maybe even investors or consultants since then that helped you in refining this?
Yes, so pretty much everyone pushed back on the numbers during the competition, which was great because it helped us figure out, what was reasonable, because really a bunch of these guys have invested in similar companies or similar enterprises, so they get a sense of what things are like. Nigeria is a strange beast because not many, there's not as much experience on the panel for Africa, I think, as there is for Europe or the US or the more developed economies. So we still got away with a bit of there was a bit of leeway that we were Nigerian, so we understood the market more than anyone else did. But people definitely did push back.
So it's this idea of how do you think about what could happen next, but you need to be realistic and balance that with program quality and learning and being able to adjust too.
That's true, and having had the pilot on the ground beforehand, even though I think it was 15 people that came through the pilot, but I think that gave us a lot more legitimacy in actually telling judges that we know what this works like. We've done this before. This is going to be 10 times what we did originally, but it's it's still pretty much the same thing, expanded.
Right. Thank you. So then we get to measuring results, and again, this is an area where it's hard to say in your initial business plan what those results are going to be, but at least thinking about what some key indicators might be. And this again goes back to the life cycle of the inputs to impact, and back to the theory of change too. But thinking carefully about enough indicators and key indicators, but not spending all of your time measuring, and making sure that you realize what's driving those measurements too. And that these should be things that are focused on improving your program and not simply for the sake of gathering measurements. It's an interesting challenge because, again, you're at an early stage where you don't know where this is going to play out, so it's going to be a work in progress. Brian, this is a great chance. I would love to hear from you of how did you initially think about this, and what's proved helpful in your measurements and what hasn't?
Yeah. I read the lists, so I have this saved somewhere of the presentation that we did last year, which I'm happy to share if someone wants to have
I think we actually, so I should mention, WAVE has their presentation online on our website.
We do?
You're one of the
great.
organizations that we feature, so you can get more context for Brian's experience from there.
Cool. So we had I'm trying to think of the measures that we had, but we had quite a few. So things like placement rates. So a really important indicator of how well we're doing is when you place these kids in hotels or retailers, how many of them that went through a program get placed, and their retention rate as well. So how do they do after they've been placed? So the 4 parts of our value chain were recruitment, getting them into our system, training, placement, and retention or continual training. So we had metrics for each of them, a couple of metrics for each of them to make sure that we were tracking to optimal on each of the steps of the value chain. So for example, for recruiting, we had how many people actually applied to us, just to have a sense of how effective our marketing was. In training, we had, in recruiting, we also had a test for the emotional intelligence capacity. So we had to, in addition to getting people in, we had to refine and test how good our emotional intelligence tests were. So we're basically checking, so this person scored really highly on this test. Are we happy with them? Like, was that test actually useful in figuring out how good they were? And then in training, we had effectively similar to what HBS might have, but tests around, how well people performed in the training compared to how well they performed later on. So, i.e., is our training actually effective or not? And then placement, obviously, I've mentioned the fact that we want as many people to be placed as possible. So luckily, we're actually at around 90% today on placement rates. So it's going pretty well so far. But we basically we're trying to have a very high placement rate because that's a big part of our marketing to kids later on. Mm-hmm. And then the one that we are probably still a little bit early on trying to nail is metrics for after we've placed people on how well they're doing, because that involves a lot of us actually working with the employers, figuring out how their review systems work and tapping into that on a very continuous, easy basis. Mm-hmm. So we haven't gotten that right yet, but I mean, we effectively have a bunch of metrics in each of those steps of the value chain that we're trying to tie back into our mission.
Okay. And tied in with your theory of change and your specific mission.
That's right, that's right.
Good. So whenever we put up this slide, I think people get to feel a little nervous. When you think about risks, I was talking to a colleague earlier today, and we said talking about risks is like that interview question of, so tell me some of your faults, tell me some of your deficits, and you always come up with this answer of, oh, I'm just way too organized, and it actually creates a real problem, things like that. But risks are actually a chance for you in your business plan to present to investors, to present to partners that you know the field and that you recognize that there are going to be risks. And it's a chance to bring those up front and let them know how you're thinking about it. Not trying to eliminate the risks. Some of these things you cannot change the culture of a given society, or you cannot change necessarily the patterns of people, but being able to bring those things to the front and let people know that you've been thinking about them. So Brian, without going into your risks specifically for your organization, mm-hmm. But just talking more generally, how did you think about how to present this to investors in a way that would be productive?
Yeah, I think an interesting framework perhaps, I don't know if we use this in this way particularly, but I think it's interesting, is to look at it as your market risk, which is effectively your risk of that theory of change that you have kind of being wrong to some extent. Mm-hmm. And at a high level, like for us, for example, we could have been wrong that the key drivers were what we thought the key drivers were, mm-hmm. and that's pretty big. So there's a market risk, there's your operational risk, which involves when you're actually on the ground, all these things that you think might help alleviate the problem could work in different ways from how you expected. Mm-hmm. And then a big one is your team risk as well. So I think this might be even bigger for social enterprises than it is for for-profits. Mm-hmm. Simply because, at least at HBS, this might be different for other schools. So the passion with which people apply to the competition might not be the same passion that they take to the actual job afterwards. So you've got to be careful that the mission isn't compromised by either team movements or even not getting the right people on board early. Mm-hmm. So I think a pretty interesting way perhaps of categorizing the risks that with pretty much any business or any enterprise is to place them in those categories and just figure out what is it that could go really, really wrong in each of these categories.
And thinking about the new venture competition specifically, or broadening this to any time that you might be able to pitch to investors or partners, were you proactive in putting those risks out there, or did you wait to be asked about them?
I think we put them out there right away. Mm-hmm. One of the big questions, especially during the final round of the competition, was which one of you is actually going to run this? Mm-hmm. So that team risk, right? And I think at that point of time, we knew that Misan was on board. It wasn't clear how me and the other co-founder were going to be involved. And for them, it was important that they were dealing with people who were 100% committed to the business, to the enterprise. And we had to basically just be very clear, you know, this is, yes, one of us will be on the ground, and this is definitely going to happen. But even if, you know, we are not on the ground, this is how we're going to be getting involved. And this is how we're going to cover for the roles that might seem like vacuums from us not being on the ground. And I think like bringing it up front in that way makes it much easier for you to not be on the defensive when they come up against you.
That's a great point. And I want to clarify that specifically around the New Venture competition, your team doesn't need to be committed to moving this forward, but to your point, needs to at least address if this is going to go forward, how will it? And so I think being proactive is better than having to scramble backwards and being asked the question and put on the spot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, great. We're going to talk financials, but we're not going to go into too much detail here. I just want to outline that there's some things that you think about from a startup perspective, and again, you'll have a chance to look at this PowerPoint later. But also want to think about it as you're going forward too, and the fact that if you're not thinking about sustainability up front, and if you're not thinking about different revenue sources and broad revenue sources, that good and bad projects die when cash ends. So being able to pay attention to those things. I think this is a moment where it's interesting to talk about nonprofit and for-profit models. So from a very general sense, if you can address how Wave thought about that.
So this was actually a really big, I think we spent about 7 months of last year, after we finished, discussing this question. So we initially wanted this to be a for-profit business for the sake of sustainability. And we actually had the discussion in that room around making sure that this was definitely a for-profit business. And the fourth member of the team, whose parents ran a education institution in Togo, was even more gung-ho about for-profit. So we entered the competition pretty much being sure that we were going to go down the for-profit path. But I think somehow during the process, we became convinced, both in speaking to investors, speaking to other businesses, being put in touch with non-profits here that do similar things. Which one is the one that places, I forget the name of the one that places kids.
Europe?
Gap Year? Europe, exactly. And similar institutions, that there was just as much scope to make change as a non-profit as there was as a for-profit. And not only that, we became convinced in speaking to the guys that would eventually fund us for the round of funding that we just raised in December, that actually being a non-profit might make sense to give us the patience to figure out how this model works. And the Wave model is, we're doing this right now for hospitality, but it's potentially repeatable for other industries and other sectors. So if we could figure out how our emotional intelligence test worked, how placement best worked, how to retain people and so on and so forth, we could always use that and then, you know, reuse it again in a different model later on. But the important thing was that we had the patience, you know, to actually just figure out the model without, you know, anyone knocking on our doors for money. And I mean, it also helped that they only invest in nonprofits, so that kind of pushed us towards that path. But we spent a lot of time going back and forth on this. I don't really think there's a right answer. I don't think that it necessarily should change the mission or your daily job that much. But where it might be important is in how you align or orient your team members, because some people might come into it, you know, with the perspective of, you know, I want this to become $1 million business in 5 years' time, right? Which is absolutely fine, you know, or it might be really fully about the mission and, you know, trying to get the bottom of the pyramid. That's actually a good point to finish on. Another conflict was around, if we are for profit, how can we really get to the bottom of the bottom? And we, some of us thought we could, some of us thought maybe we couldn't. Just because you have to charge something, and we do charge something to our students, by the way, you know, but if you're making profit off it, it kind of limits how far you can go down to people at the bottom of the pyramid. So yeah, I mean, so yeah, we struggled over this for quite a while.
Well, it's interesting that it definitely plays into the financials, but then it brings you back to that very first decision around the mission and your theory of change too. Yeah. I'm going to end this part with an acronym that one of our faculty members put together, because it's just easy to remember, around BEST. So BEST, the most effective option, economical, at the lowest cost, especially depending on the service that you're trying to provide. Solidarity for all who need it, and today, as urgently as possible. And that's supposed to give you the motivation to be moving forward on these ideas. I'm going to open it up for Q&A in a minute, so think about your questions, and we're going to have microphones available so we can pick you up on the videotape. But want to point out an upcoming workshop that's happening. This is around testing your social venture. The idea that you go into the market, you start to test this idea, and then you have to come back and iterate, and the idea evolves as you're getting feedback from the market. We have a number of other workshops around legal issues and office hours with specific practitioners where you can come in as an individual or team and look at specific issues too. So any of you who are signed up for the New Venture Competition will be getting emails about that, but you can also check out our website to get details. And we had our first deadline for the New Venture Competition yesterday. That was the early registration deadline. Our final registration deadline, and where anyone who did the pre-registration also gets in their entry form and executive summaries and so forth, is on March 25th. So you still have some time to put together teams, flesh out your idea a little bit, and take advantage of this competition. Okay. So we'd like to do some Q&A, and if you can either go to a microphone, or do we have someone who's bringing a microphone around to folks too who are in different areas? Okay, so if you have microphones on either side of the room, and if you can find one of those, and we can then capture your question for everyone here. Yeah, I think we can hear you. And as you start, if I could ask you to identify yourself, and then we're going to try and keep these questions not specific to your own organization, but of broader interest to the group as well, so everyone can benefit from those answers too.
Okay, my name is Mira Mehta. I'm a second-year HBS student. Right. And my question is just around team size. If we're thinking about a for-profit social enterprise, you have to think about sustainability in terms of salary and who can actually do this full-time. So I'm wondering how that affects how you should be thinking about team size for the purposes of the competition versus team size for who's going forward.
Sure, yeah. And that's a great question, because the team that you start with may not be the team that ends up launching this. As Brian pointed out, you may have a couple core members who know that they're committed to this, but they're trying to get skill sets from other places. We've generally seen team sizes range anywhere from about 3 to 5 people. I think there's first of all just the logistics of how do you actually get people in that room over in the iLab, how do you get enough people so that you're getting different points of view, but that you also can get consensus on how to move forward on things. We've oftentimes seen entries where there's a core team of that 3 to 4 people, but then you might have advisors that you use in other ways. And again, as we see those teams, we might see maybe 1 or 2 moving forward. But it's a really important conversations to have up front, and being able to say, how many of you, if this does end up being something that we're still passionate about and has legs, just getting a gauge of who in the room does want to move this forward, and who knows they're doing something totally different but wants to be involved in a different way. I think those are some of the important questions to ask. Yep.
Is there a bias against having a team of 1 or 2 and those are both going to move forward, or is that something that doesn't really make a difference?
So the question, so I can capture it, is there a bias towards having a smaller team of 1 to 2 people? I think what we've seen is that if there's an individual, there's probably going to at least be questions. You probably want to have a good group around you, because there are going to be questions about, do you have enough skill sets and perspectives that are being brought to the table? And to the point of, do you have your consultants, but do you also have people who've been in operation roles and so forth? So if they're not a, kind of an official team member, who are you surrounding yourself with advisors? But we've rarely seen the smaller teams, and it just is a matter of, you can really differentiate between here's the team and who's moving forward. Yeah. Can I ask you to go to one of the microphones so we can capture what you're asking? We have a question over here first.
Hi, my name is Daniel Uribe. I'm an intern at Escala. We're residents at the iLab, and we're going to participate in the social enterprise track. Can you expand on that, when you move from being for-profit to non-profit, that transition, and how was the dialogue with investors, and some of the reasons why you did the change?
Yeah.
Question.
So I mean, I suppose the main reason that we made the change was that the person who was going to go full-time on the business afterwards was leaning towards nonprofit. So there was a team of 4 people, and we talked about this. And at the end of the day, the person that is running this afterwards is the person that has the heaviest weight in whatever decision we make. But the rationale for it was, so the point that I was making around, what do we really care about? Is it reaching to as many people that are underprivileged as possible, or reaching to the cream just above that and going as long as possible and having money to go for? And it's a really tough one to answer because so before that I worked for a company called D-Lights, which sells solar powered lamps, and I worked for them in Nigeria. And I remember one question that I always had was, could we just sell these a little bit cheaper and even more people would buy them? And it's difficult to call that because then you would be making profit and you would be able to make more of them and be more sustainable. And I think that we basically just ended up making the call that, for these next few years, what matters the most to us is that we get this model right, and we reach out to the people that need us the most. And we think being a non-profit will allow us to do that better than being a for-profit will. And then after that, it's very possible that we can then take that model and replicate it in different industries as a for-profit if we need to. And everyone seemed to be happy with that decision.
Had you already had any conversations with investors before you made that decision, or was it pre-conversations?
It was, so we had a discussion both before and after we had conversations with investors. I think that most investors, at least angel investors, wanted us to be for-profit. And especially investors in Nigeria. And in fact, people still today tell us, why are you non-profit? There's so much space in this market. Yeah. You should be a for-profit. So I think it wouldn't have made, so I guess another question that we had to ourselves was, is this going to make a big difference in how much money we can raise and how easily we can raise it? It probably would have been easier to be a for-profit and raise money as a for-profit. But we had one investor who, right from the competition, it was very clear that they were very, very interested in us. And they ended up actually investing in us, DRK, Draper Richards Kaplan, and they only invest in nonprofits, I believe. So we kind of had a stake in the ground for being a nonprofit because we could see that things were going at least relatively well with DRK. But it could have been that we got to a point and we had no money whatsoever, and we had to become a for-profit to raise money from those angels that wanted us to be a for-profit. But in the absence of money, without considering money, we thought that non-profit rather was the better way for us to go. But we could have been swayed based on the availability of money towards for-profit.
Yes.
I have a follow-up to Mira's question about the team size. And say if you have some of your team members who are not part of the Harvard institution, they are based in other continents, other countries, and they might be potential board members. Is that acceptable?
I'd rather leave some of the competition questions that are specific to an organization until after the presentation so we can make the most use of Brian's time here. So I'm happy to answer that offline for you.
Thank you.
Okay. Questions here? I have a lot of questions for Brian, but I also want to make sure that we are able to hear from the group here if others have questions they want to get in. Okay. Brian, I'd love for you to spend just a minute in talking about how you might leverage the resources at HBS and Harvard generally as you're thinking about your idea.
How we did, or how I might do it now? If
how you might do it now? Yes.
So I think one of the biggest resources is professors. We didn't really think about this much, but now that by the way, I'm here working part-time with the professor, Clay Christensen, who does stuff on innovation and disruption. But now that I've had, I guess, more exposure to how the inside of HBS works, I think there's a lot of, help, contacts, connections, just like general, step back and think about how this works, that professors at HBS can give. Another great thing that I didn't really look at when I was at HBS, that I'm getting a bit more of a sense of now, is just like the breadth of intellectual capacity that is here in Cambridge, outside HBS. So you have the rest of the schools at Harvard, you have MIT, which has like so much cool stuff happening. And there's a bunch of professors at MIT that actually do stuff that intersects with emerging markets, Africa, and some pretty interesting things that could have been useful for us. You know, I don't know, like, you know, education online, some pretty cool things that we didn't really explore while we were doing this. But there's a lot out there from professors.
I'm going to question here.
Hi, my name's Dave Norman. I'm actually work for a nonprofit organization called Face Africa. So I'm more of a, I guess you could call an entrepreneur, trying to transition them towards more of a social business. We work on clean water solutions in Western Africa, specifically in Liberia, which is, you know, the second poorest country in the world. So there's quite a few challenges there. My question actually is towards Brian. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the importance of effective partnerships and how you form partnerships, sort of the process around that, and how important that is towards an effective social business model.
So like I mentioned, we tried to go sort of mass market with our marketing to get people to apply to us. That was like almost an absolute failure. But what has worked is actually getting in touch with NGOs or other organizations on the ground who already have the, you know, this database of people. So in many of these, at least in Africa, in many of these Western African countries, there's normally like 1 or 2 people that know everyone, like basically like know who runs the UN's organization there, DFID, the UK's development organization there. And you've got to figure out who those people are, because they basically help you figure out, you know, where are the sources of funding from, and who are the right partners to know to get in touch with both the government and the private sector people. So that's, I think it's when we got that we really started to see some progress in getting people into our program.
Question over here.
Hi, my name is Tibisay Morgandi. I am an LLM student at the law school. My question relates to the promotion of the project. How do you concretely reach out to the investors? Is like a strategy that you have that relates maybe to the kind of project you have, or you could say there is an overall strategy that could apply to different projects. Thank you.
So we had probably 80% of the investor conversations that we had came from people that we met during the competition. And so you have a panel with a bunch of people from different backgrounds. Make sure you take their business cards afterwards, and just like keep pounding them for attention. And then they can introduce you to other people who are also interested. So we basically just got a bunch of connections from the people that we met at that competition. And then we also just used our previous job contacts and our classmates as well to help us widen that pool of access.
There's a plug for the New Venture competition right there. We have about a minute left. I'm going to ask Brian overarching advice. If you were to leave this group with one thing to take from this conversation, what would you want them to take?
Yeah, I think the key thing, whether you make it through or not, the New Venture competition, because a lot of people don't make it through and then are still fantastically successful afterwards, is to see it as a platform for preparing yourself and like formalizing your plan. And in taking it seriously, what we got that was even more important than the money that we won was just like a lot of like mental energy spent on the project, and almost like you become more committed when you've spent so much time in it. It's a really strange thing. And by the end, I think we knew for sure that we were going to take this forward, whether or not we won. So I guess I would say take it seriously, because that actually, funny enough, makes it more likely that you will succeed at the project, whether or not you succeed at raising money.
Great. I think it's a great point of advice. We've heard from many students that the process of the New Venture competition, from developing the executive summary to developing your pitch, is a forcing mechanism. And you're doing this in a very kind environment, but also a very resource-rich environment where you can take the risk to try those ideas and be pushed forward on them too. And we have workshops to support that. You have teams around you to support it. So what I'm hearing you say is do the New Venture competition.
Yeah, and take it seriously. I mean, don't just do it, but take it very seriously.
Yeah. And to your point also, we've had many people who have not necessarily been the winner or the runner-up but their ideas have been successful because of the feedback and the process that they've gone through with the competition. Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you to Brian for offering your perspectives and your experience.